Morning, everybody. As Josh said, thank you so much for taking the time to be out here with us today. We know we're all busy clinicians and practitioners, and taking the time on the weekend to grow and develop really says a lot about you, and that's really what this day is all about, is how do we continually develop daily. So all of us are clinicians, and what we're discussing, what we're humbled to be able to discuss with you guys today is our principles, processes, and plans for rehabilitation. So what we want to discuss with you guys today is our big why. Why do we do what we do, and how do we create systems and put these things in place that we can consistently refine ourselves and consistently reflect on our process. So like Josh said, that when we talk to you when we're doing another seminar, hopefully things are different. Hopefully things are a little bit more refined, and we're trying to make a better product and really check ourselves. So it's been stated that it takes around 10,000 hours to develop mastery in a skill. So we would argue that these hours need to be constantly refined. They need to have guardrails, as Josh said, a way to examine them. So just like computers need algorithms to make decisions, so do we. We need to be able to take the data that we look at and have some sort of way to make sense of the complexity of it, some way to make sense of what's working, what's not working, and how can we refine this process so that in 10 years we're not just doing the same thing. In 10 years we're looking at our data and we're learning from that data. So what we want to discuss with you today is how to develop blueprints, how to develop ways to analyze what we're doing and how to consistently refine ourselves.
Yeah, I think our big goal really with this entire seminar is to make sure that we don't leave you all with just more tools for your toolbox. So tools meaning certain methods and strategies and assessments that you can implement, of course, so the foundation and the fundamentals, the why and the how and the what behind everything we're doing. We think about just increasing our tools from the toolbox, we kind of limit our adaptability to variable situations. Or it's a little bit more challenging to navigate the water into complexity and making things a little bit more simple. So we said, hey, let's kind of take away some of those rigid attachments so we don't feel like we have to abide by a certain or subscribe to a certain method. Thinking of things such as DNS or SFMA, PRI, Nathan, Mulligan, there's a lot of different things we can choose from. It's okay to choose to those, but we need to understand, again, our foundation. And our goal is to make sure that when you leave here, your tool shed is a little bit more robust. And so our big goal today is to make sure that, hey, let's give you the principles, let's give you all phases of rehabilitation, and then understanding throughout the continuum, how can that kind of change a little bit and navigate depending on the person that's in front of you, as well as what their angles are. So that's where the case studies will give you a little bit more context behind how to navigate and negotiate some of those barriers and what you can do.
So like we said, we're taking big picture today. So our objective is to discuss that big level why. So we're going to talk about why it's important to form blueprints and what blueprints really are and what they're made of. We're going to discuss our Rehab to Form first principles that help guide this decision-making process and help guide what we do on a daily basis. We're going to break after halfway through our principles, and we're going to break into a lab to kind of discuss those first three and kind of show how we execute these things and what that looks like on the ground level, just to avoid getting too lost in the clouds with this stuff. And then we're going to discuss building your playbook with checklists and phases. Like Jared says, we want to teach you guys how to build a tool shed. So we want to show you that our principles, our processes, our plans do not need to be yours. Our setting is not your setting. So our goal for you today is to translate these big picture things into things that you do every day. How does this work for you? How is this useful for you? So keep that in mind as we go through the day today. So think of trying to build a house with no guidance. You just have a jumbled mess of tools, materials. How likely do you think you're going to be successful to build that house, right? And in some off chance you do make that happen, what's the likelihood you're going to be able to replicate that? And when you probably inevitably go wrong, right, how are you going to know which step you messed up so that you do it again? How do you get better? So if we don't have some sort of plan in place, if we don't have some sort of blueprint that's an overarching thing that's guiding us, like we said, it's really hard to analyze. It's really hard to be critical of your process. So what we need to do to mitigate this is we need to form blueprints. So what blueprints are is theoretical frameworks that help us make sense of the complexity of what we do. We all work with human beings in some way, shape, or form, and human beings at the end of the day are extremely complex. A does not always equal B. Small changes can make a large scale difference. So how do we keep track of that? Well, these blueprints need to be made of different smaller models and ways that we can analyze things. So like Jared mentioned, PRI, SFMA, DNS, FRC, all of these things can be seen as smaller models within a blueprint. They can live together contiguously. They don't need to be separated, but as we'll discuss, if we start looking through just one of these lenses, we start getting blind spots. So blueprints do a few things for us, as I mentioned. They help us make sense of the complex. And I really like these quotes from Franz Bosch, as they really envelop the fact that we don't really know oftentimes what stimulus we're providing, what it's creating. We have 7-8 subsystems in the body, or 7-8 major systems with a ton of different subsystems, all captained by this intricate brain we have that we really are just beginning to understand. So when we provide a stimulus, that response is nowhere near predictable. So as mentioned, these blueprints help us take this complex system and whittle it down to smaller, more understandable, more manipulable parts that help us understand, how can I interact here? What is my controllables? What are my factors that I can influence and help us act then? If not, if we start looking at this complexity, we can get paralyzed from it if we don't have smaller places, ways to analyze our process. So as we come to terms with this lack of being able to know, with this lack of certainty, we realize that managing these complex systems is more about influencing probabilities and possibility of change rather than making any sort of prediction. So blueprints can help us provide boundaries or guardrails, like Josh said, to view these dynamic relationships, to view these changes we're seeing, and help us to move forward and make decisions. So Sir Osler said, medicine is the science of uncertainty and art of probability. And we're going to talk today about how blueprints can help to make your odds of being right a little bit higher. So blueprints help make you a better thinker. And I think that this quote from Richard Feynman really spells it out. He's talking about this of building models. He says it enforces a scientific habit of mind which I would characterize as one of militant ignorance, an iron commitment to I don't know, that all scientific knowledge is uncertain, contingent, subject to revision, and falsible in principle. So blueprints keep us from fooling ourselves. Another Richard Feynman quote, don't fool yourself and you're the easiest person to fool. So this beautifully illustrates what a concept known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, okay? And what basically that spells out is that the people with the least amount of knowledge seem to always find a way to have the most confidence. So if we're looking through one lens, yeah, it makes sense. This is all that's out there. This is, I know everything. Call that the I just read my first book effect, right? Then you start to realize that, hey, maybe things are a little more complex than I thought. And we take that long slide down to the valley of despair. So what we would argue is that's not such a bad place to be, because once we realize that things are complex and we may not know, that's when we start putting guardrails in place. That's where we kind of lose some of this hubris and start to develop processes and start to think, how can I refine my process? And when you realize that you can't know, that's when change can really start to happen. So why blueprints? To increase perspective. So like I said, if we're constantly looking through one lens, if we're constantly looking at things through one point of view, it can lead to blind spots. It can make us myopic, right? So if I develop different lenses, different ways to look at the world, and then figure out how to put these things together, I may have a better viewpoint. So like we were talking, these different systems out there, Mulligan, Maitland, PRI, FMS, SFMA, and these different thought processes of, like Josh was talking about, some people are looking maybe a little more through a pain science lens. Maybe some people are looking through like more of a biomechanical lens or biopsychosocial lens. There's nothing inherently wrong about any of these lenses, but if we only have one, like we said, things get very myopic. So our goal should be to develop whatever lenses are going to be useful for us with the population we work with, and things that can be easily translated to our clinical practice. And then try to develop as many of those lenses as possible, but more importantly, learn when to put them on and learn how to combine multiple lenses to make your vision a little bit more clear. So like we said, we're not worried about necessarily one tool in the toolbox or what tool you're necessarily using. We want to understand, how do we organize these tools? How do we pick the right tool at the right time? And when you're constantly collecting data, constantly having a process that gives you guardrails, that can allow you to be a little more accurate at picking the right tool at the right time. And then when you come across that situation again, we can be more accurate again. And then if we're not doing the right thing, we catch ourselves before we've gone too far. So blueprints have actually, and having a model, having a formal model, has actually shown to increase the probability of being right, as we discussed before. So in a book called Expert Political Judgment, Does It Matter? By Philip Tetlock, he presented a really cool study where they took 10,000 people and they just looked at how do they make decisions and how accurate are they. So they separated people into a couple different groups, into undergraduate students. They separated into people that were a little bit more like specialists. So they had one tool that they used really well, one way of viewing the world that they saw very clearly out of. They looked at people that maybe had a little bit smaller skill set in a number of things. So maybe a little bit more of your Renaissance type people that can do a couple of things reasonably well and think with a certain number of models in a maybe less deep way. And then they looked at computer algorithms, and they looked at people using formal models. What they found is that the undergrads were terrible. All right, the formal models blew everybody out of the water. It's followed second by computer algorithms. So what we find is that over this large number of decision-making processes, if we have a system in place, if we have a reason and a why and something that's structured, we seem to be right way more often than if we do not. Like we said, we're trying to just increase the probability of what we're doing is correct. We're trying to increase the probability of success, because in complex systems, that's really all that we can do, and then try to catch ourselves before we fall off route. So our blueprints, our models, are built off of principles. So what principles do is they tie us to the mast. So if anyone's familiar with the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey, at one point, the boat comes up to the island of the Sirens. And the Sirens' song was known to carry wisdom and have things to learn from. However, the Siren song made people crazy. It made them jump ship, lose track of everything they were doing. So Odysseus asked his crew to tie him to the mast. They all put wax in their ears so they couldn't hear, but he wanted the wisdom from the song. He wanted to learn from that information. But he did not want to lose track. He didn't want to go off course, so he had his crew tie him down. So in our world, there's a lot of sirens. There's a lot of information out there, and you can argue that we're in a sea of information, but we're starving for context, right? So all of these things, whether it be social media, PubMed articles, Con Ed courses just like this, oftentimes try to pull you off path. They try to get your ship direct because they make us feel like we don't know enough. They make us feel like we don't have the right tool to do this thing, or that we need to do something better. They make us insecure. However, there's wisdom to be gained from all of this stuff. However, we need something to tie us to the mast. We need something to hold us accountable to our base level beliefs. And that's what really defining and looking down at what your core principles are can do for you. So as mentioned, principles are really the guts of the blueprint, all right? That's what kind of we look at and say, why are we doing this? Why is this important? And that we can build everything up from there. So in order to find your principles, it's a Socratic method where you just ask why, and so you simply can't ask why anymore. So you get down to these like base level truths, okay? So that can be laws of nature, physics, chemistry, whatever that you need, or just these beliefs of what it is to interact with a human. So these things should be very simple. They should be very easily understood, and they shouldn't require context. So what you'll see with our principles here, it doesn't matter if the person's 8 years old or 88, athlete, non-athlete. These principles work with everybody, with any human being you're working within your setting. So Jared and I are now going to go through and define our principles. So we're going to go through principles 1 through 3. We're going to break for lab. We're going to go through some lab that works with those 3 principles. And then Jared will follow through with principles 4, 5, and 6. So principle number 1 is to provide movement options to our people. So the term movement variability has been increasingly popular in our field as of recent years. We look at this concept of movement variability as letters in the alphabet. So we think if we don't have all the letters available to us in the alphabet, how good are we going to be at putting together words? How many paragraphs can we write? Can we put together a book? We're going to be very limited in what we choose to do. We can still do things. We can still put words together, but we're going to be limited in what we can make happen. So when looking at this concept and looking at our people, we want to provide them with the movement options that are necessary for the tasks they need to produce. So one of my favorite quotes on variability or definitions of variability is from one of my foundational mentors, Bill Hartman. He stated, "Variability provides people with options, capacity for learning, and flexibility in behaviors to meet the demands of and adapt to the environment in which they are functioning." So let's unwrap that a little bit. So essentially what this means is it's all dependent on the task at hand. It's all dependent on context. So does a power lifter need as much range of motion or flexibility as a gymnast? No, we can argue that trying to do that would be deleterious to the task and the demand of the power lifter. So when we look at movement options, it's not maximize whatever we can, it's maximize what's going to be useful for that person. So part of that process then needs to be, we need to be able to assess what specifically does this person need? And in that context of what they may need, what may they be lacking? So again, we take things from a big picture and we try to break it down to its component parts. All right, we look at this complex system and say, okay, what things need to happen? What things need to be true in order for this person to most efficiently perform their task? And that's when we can start looking at these movement options. So a useful thinking model that I want to talk to you guys about today, in trying to simplify this. So like the famous George Box quote, all models are wrong, some are useful. I want to present a model where we're breaking movement options down into 2 component parts, absorption and propulsion. So we can look at that and say all movement has to be either absorptive, I'm decelerating, I'm controlling force, or I'm propelling or producing force. So if we look at things through those 2 positions, we can break movements down to what's needed for an absorptive phase or a deceleratory phase, and what's needed for a push-off, accelerative, or propulsive phase. So you guys have this on your sheets as well if you want to reference that throughout this, because we'll kind of talk through some specific examples with our movement options. But we can break every joint down into its most efficient position to exhibit absorption propulsion. And as presented, this is a spectrum. All right, so if I'm going to decelerate, if I'm going to land from a jump, right, I'm not going to do very well if my ankle is in a position of supination and inversion, right? I need to get into dorsiflexion, eversion. Same with the knee. I don't land very well with a straight knee. I don't land very well with an externally rotated hip. And we can break this down all the way through the thorax and up to the shoulders, elbows, and wrist for many cases. It gets a little cloudy in the upper extremity at times just because of the lack of constraints we have there and the amount of range of motion we have. But most of the stuff lays pretty true. And we can